Hello, everybody. Welcome to this IBIA webinar hosted by IBIA's European Regional Board. A lot of regulatory changes are currently being introduced in Europe, and we will discuss those as well as their impact on the bunkering industry. We will be having 5 short presentations focusing specifically on the ARA region. We will introduce the RED III directive. We will look at the regulations on mass flow meter and sampling. And then we will hear the perspectives of the marine fuel buyers, suppliers, and from IBIA as well. After the presentations, there will be a Q&A session where we'll answer as many questions as possible. In case we cannot reply all due to time constraints, we will revert separately after the webinar with answers to those questions that we didn't manage to take. For those of you not familiar with IBIA, IBIA is an international organization with members in about 70 different countries, dealing with all aspects related to the marine energy value chain. We represent the marine fuel sector and actively engage with legislators, shipping association, port authorities, and so on. IBIA has a strong focus on improving the understanding and knowledge, while also enhance the transparency of the industry. We also drive the development of industry best practice, and we support the transition towards low and zero carbon fuels. IBIA also lobbies for effective and workable regulations, for example, through the work we do in IMO. IBIA has 4 regional boards, 1 in Asia, 1 in Middle East and Africa, 1 in America, and 1 in Europe. The European board was announced at the IBIA's annual convention back in 2024. It has 8 members representing various sides of the industry, and we meet regularly throughout the year to discuss regional updates and to be a link between IBIA and Europe where relevant. We also support IBIA's work towards improved industry transparency. We are here to support the industry, so please feel free to reach out to any European board member, either through this email address that's stated here, or when you meet us at events, conferences, meetings, whatever, throughout the world. So with this, I'm very proud to introduce a strong panel of speakers to share industry developments and perspective. Please use the chat room to post your questions at any time during the webinar. With no further delay, let me introduce our very first speaker, Sofia Fürstenberg-Stott, who is a partner of Fürstenberg Maritime Advisory. Sofia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that introduction, and good day, everyone. I have been invited here to introduce the impact for shipping on the RED III directive. I have prepared a presentation that is quite dense in information, and I've done so purposefully because I hope that you can use this presentation as a repository afterwards. But I will not go through all the details you can see on these slides, but this is the content essentially. I will give you an introduction of the Renewable Energy Directive 3, and then I will give an example of how this is being implemented into national law. So I will take you through the Dutch fuel transition obligation under RED III. And at the very end, I will give a snapshot of how different national legislations are implementing RED III differently, using Germany and Belgium as further examples. In a nutshell, the Renewable Energy Directive is not regulating the ship owners. It's regulating the fuel suppliers and the fuel production. And they're regulating this to meet the renewable energy and greenhouse gas reduction targets, and doing so that they require that any renewable fuel claim can be traceable, and this through the audited mass balance systems, and that it's linked to a physical fuel delivery. And if we compare RED III to FuelEU Maritime, they are interlinked, but they are very different here. So RED III is regulating the fuel suppliers via the member states, whereas FuelEU Maritime regulates the ship operators. RED III regulates the sustainability of the fuel and the accounting of that sustainability. And it's a directive, whereas FuelEU Maritime is an EU-wide mandatory regulation. But the connection here is also that in order for a ship owner to comply with FuelEU Maritime, the fuel that he is buying in the EU needs to comply with the RED III directive, otherwise it's not eligible. So that's the connection here. So RED III sets a target for 2030 that transport-wide, so that is land-based and all kind of transport in the EU, is to have reached a 14.5% greenhouse gas reduction by that date, compared to a baseline, and this is on a fuel portfolio level. And the fuel portfolio baseline is at 94 gram CO2 per megajoule. And you would need to have reached a 14.5% greenhouse gas reduction portfolio-wise by 2030. And also that by this date, there is to be a 5.5% of that portfolio of advanced biofuels and RFNBOs. And RFNBO stands for renewable fuels of non-biologic origin. And there is also a distinct maritime target that by 2030, the maritime fuel portfolio is to have a 1.2% share of RFNBOs. So RED III requires physical traceability and mass balance. So in order to be eligible under RED III, you need to meet certain sustainability and greenhouse gas criteria. This needs to be tracked via an audited mass balance, and it needs to be registered in the EU Union database. And why is this database important? Because this is where you have the energy reduction unit, which you are trading under this scheme. And each unit is equal to a kilo CO2 reduction. And you can't trade these certificates outside of this database. And then some nomenclature. RED III talks about different types of fuel, which are eligible under RED III and which are not. And first, it's the advanced biofuels that is produced from the feedstocks that are listed here. And they fall under an Annex 9A. And these are residual fuels from agriculture and forestry and certain wastes from industries. Annex 9A. And then there is an Annex 9B, and these are also eligible under RED III, but they are capped. They're capped at 1.7% within the EU, and these are used cooking oils and category 1 and 2 animal fats. RFNBOs eligible. These are e-methanol, e-LNG, e-methane, and renewable hydrogen and its derivatives, and this is where ammonia falls in under. But they're only eligible if they can prove that they accomplish at least 70% greenhouse gas reduction compared to its fossil fuel competitor. And it's the same for RCFs, recycled carbon fuels. These are also eligible fuels made from industrial waste gases or from non-renewable waste streams. They need to accomplish a 70% greenhouse gas reduction to be eligible. Then there are fuels which are not eligible under RED III, and these are those that are conventional biofuels, and they are listed here. 3 categories: crop-based biofuels, fuels from category 3 animal fats, and fuels from other non-annex waste or residues. But now we come to what may be impacting most of you right now. And that is the implementation of RED III international law, which is happening in the Netherlands. And it's called the Dutch Fuel Transition Obligation. And I am not an authority on this. And this information I am presenting here comes from open sources from the Dutch Senate. And this is from December 10 last year. Although the implementation date is 1st of January, as far as I know and understand, it has still not yet been implemented. So it's been a little bit delayed. Nevertheless, we can expect this to be implemented very soon. And it says that on a fuel portfolio perspective, audited on a year-by-year basis, a fuel supplier needs to accomplish a 2.9 reduction of CO2 equivalents in that fuel portfolio. It has been reduced from 3.6, which was the original proposal. And whereas you can also be allowed to use up to 1.1 percentage points from other, using credits from other sectors. And then there is an increased percentage point all up until 2030 for shipping, reaching 8.2 in 2030. Portfolio level, year on year auditing. And in this regulation, they only accept Annex A fuels. And the reason for not accepting Annex B, remember that they are capped. So in the Netherlands, that cap has already been used for land-based transport. So there is no allowance left. And they could decide to let shipping in there, but they have decided not to because they are worried this will push up prices. But what they've done also is a compensation for maritime. So they can, on case-by-case basis, approve other fuels as eligible under this regulation. Nevertheless, they still need to meet the legal requirements of physical delivery to the ship, meet certain RED III sustainability criteria, be traceable under mass balance, and be explicitly accepted by the Dutch regulator. And I chose to also try and summarize what happens with LNG. So the Dutch regulation doesn't allow what they call paper greening. So book and claim doesn't work. So using fossil LNG and certificates doesn't work. Using grid injected biomethane cannot be allocated and it's not allowed. And using so-called terminal mass balance pathways also doesn't work. So the only type of LNG that could be eligible under this regulation is what you see on the right-hand side here. It needs to be physically produced, liquefied, and delivered as biomethane. That brings me to my final slide, and I'm really trying to keep within those 10 minutes that I have been given. Again, I'm not an authority on this, but what I can find in the public domain is, and I've focused on LNG here, is that Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands is currently implementing this differently. So in Germany and Belgium, they will consider to accept grid-injected biomethane and terminal mass balance. And they are also using different kinds of philosophies on the regulations, whereas Netherlands is using a molecule-based, following the molecule across its value chain, whereas Germany is using a quota-based system, and Belgium is more pragmatic and looking at this in a more transitional kind of way. And on that note, I hope you were able to stay awake, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have for me later on. Over to you, Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for this short summary of a very complex topic, at least in my opinion. Our next speaker is Martijn Hoek, the team leader of Bunkers ARA at Bureau Veritas Verifuel. Martijn, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte, for the introduction. As said, I'm in charge of the ARA operations for Verifuel, and the following slides will cover some collective experience of inspection companies in ARA since the MFM and sampling mandate. It all started with a memo released on October 16th in 2024. According to the new ADN, closed measurement for UN 3082, tanks containing heavy fuel oil could no longer be measured in the open state anymore. And then in the beginning of February, 1 month after the new ADN was effective, the first issues came to light. Barges rejected manual measurements, making quantity inspections more difficult. Leading inspection agencies like Visualab, VPS, and Verifuel started a dialogue with the authorities to get more information on the topic. And from this moment, inspection companies had to invest in certain close measurement devices. UTIs, close measuring tapes, expensive and not very effective equipment with high maintenance costs. The equipment is causing delays as they must be thoroughly cleaned between each measurement to work properly. Defeating the purpose as the close measurements were to mitigate exposure to workers. The latest Concava reports show that these extreme measures are presumably not so necessary, and surveyors and bunker tanker personnel are carrying proper PPE in order to protect themselves after all. The constant cleaning of the device creates also exposure to workers instead of measuring opening tanks. From February until last December, we had ongoing and meaningful discussions with the ILNT and the Port of Rotterdam and Antwerp about closed measurements and concerns with the upcoming MFM mandate. The topics concerned were, for example, how to verify the MFM outcome if there are no manual measurements. Will the MFM replace manual measurements entirely? Is there a backup if MFM results are questionable? And one of the most important questions for any inspector are how to protect the interests of your clients. From January 1st, 2026, the mandatory vessel manifold sampling in the MFM mandate became effective. As to the manifold sampling mandate, every vessel calling the Netherlands must be equipped with a continuous drip sampler when bunkering in the Netherlands. The ILNT will inspect and provide warnings or fines. Joint sampling from vessels manifold is mandatory if vessel complies, of course, and exceptions are only given if the representative of the counterparty is refused to board to witness. Barge operators have good awareness, clear instructions, they're all aware this is going well. The vessel crew in general is unaware, typically ask their bunker surveyors, if present, for guidance and to take care of the sampling. There is a risk, however, when, for example, a surveyor is not appointed. It might result in non-representative samples or no samples at all in case of a miscommunication between the receiving vessel and delivering bunker tanker. It's very wise as a supplier representative to follow the sampling closely and make sure there is a witness to see what's going on. And then the MFM mandate, our inspectors, but also other inspectors in ARA's experience so far are, there are various things in the way for a surveyor to do a proper inspection of the flow meter system. There are no totalizer logs and no meter profiles in general. Some of them do have one. However, most of barge representatives refuse to hand over the meter profile after bunkering. Either they are not maintained or they are refused to hand over for proper control. No sealing checklists are available. There is a sealing declaration. There are only a limited, not identically numbered sealing points. Not every valve and blind flange after the MFM is sealed as per ISO 22192. The tank stripping is mostly done incorrectly. Many barge operators do not follow the directions for stripping as they have changed while using an MFM system to reduce aeration. The bunker license does not describe a mandatory stripping procedure itself. It refers to the ISO 22192. However, I'm not sure if all barge crew members have a copy of the ISO 22192 in order to follow exactly the stripping procedure. No backflow is being deducted as well. Currently, many MFM systems do register a backflow on the totalizers when the line is opened back into the tank to register the part between the manifold and the MFM. In a sense, the quantity not being delivered. However, it's not printed on the ticket or deducted from the BDN. This might lead to BDN quantity uncertainty and missing backup tools to verify in case we are in doubt. Let's look at a few non-compliant bunker metering tickets, which are quite normal currently. We have an MFM ticket here with a batch aeration of 524%. An accountable alarm, yes. We weren't able to see what the exact alarm should be. According to the ISO standard, it should be discussed between stakeholders. This was not the case. We haven't seen it. MMQ not reached, no, means it is reached. Aeration exceeded, yes, which means this is a non-compliant bunker metering ticket with exceeding batch aeration. But as you can see, undersigned and still used as basis for a BDN. And then we have several tickets not showing all these details. Is the MMQ reached? Is the aeration exceeded? Is there a bypass? And is it opened or not? On the top, we see an accountable alarm. Usually when our surveyor asks, they're not getting to see the actual alarm that occurred during the delivery, or someone doesn't know where to find it. Then we have some mass flow meter tickets bluntly saying overall OEML R1171 accuracy is non-compliant. But as you can see, still undersigned and stamped by vessels representative and used as to base the BDN on. And in practice, usually, or in most cases, it looks like this. Bunker tanker measurements in the top, in the middle, 252.6. Mass flow meter measurements showing 258.3. And then a little bit lower, you can see vessel received measurements 252.1. After a discussion of 2.5 hours, finally it was decided to issue a BDN based on bunker tanker measurement to avoid a letter of protest, which is in a sense fine. However, the ticket was shown to be a non-compliant high aeration ticket as well. So there shouldn't have been any discussion. If there is a non-compliant metering ticket, we should be able to fall back on bunker tanker measurements. Common challenges we see now, for example, BDN figures. Are they based on MFM results, manual measurements, or loading figures? Since there is not an absolute clarity about this, there are suppliers mentioning several quantities on a BDN. Here you can see a heavy fuel oil based on an MFM, 2465.6, heavy fuel based on the loading figures. We were not able to measure this barge because it was refused, so we took tank radar measurements showing 2493 metric tons. We were not able to reach the supplier in the night, so we were not sure what to compare to and what will be the binding figures of the two. Stripping and air blowing through MFM system happens as well, creating high aeration non-compliant BMTs. Tanks are stripped one by one. As you can see, halfway the operation of a six-hour delivery, tanks were stripped one by one, increasing the drive gain, the blue line, which indicates that the device has a hard time keeping up, which results in the above because it's from the same operation. So either the MFM could also count in the disadvantage of the supplying party. So in case you are a supplier and you make use of barge operators supplying the fuel on your behalf, if misoperated, it could also be a very big disadvantage of your operation. So it's very important to train everyone. Air blowing through the MFM system after pumping is also not very advisable. This happened in this particular case as well, increasing aeration even more, creating a non-compliant MFM ticket. Totalizer issues happen as well. There are bunker tankers, not many, but there are bunker tankers without totalizers in the field. To the far right bottom, it's the micrometer of pressure per metric ton and not a totalizer indicating the amount of metric tons delivered. If you compare the last one to the next one, you're not even close to the quantity. So for a surveyor to check if the BMT is correct, there are not really any options to do so. Some bunker tankers prevent access to totalizers. They feel a surveyor shouldn't be needing to see those. The totalizer location is unknown sometimes, and the surveyor will show the barge crew where to find it. Systems are not sealed with identical seal numbers, as this is not a requirement as per MID. In case, for example, someone will forget this mold on board somewhere, everyone can seal FMS 11. Or you could even buy one and you could seal yourself. Identical numbers would be far more traceable in our opinion. Incorrect backflow calculation happens as well in the field. To the left top, totalizers before and after forward count whatever is being delivered, 80.0 metric tons. Then there are also totalizers before and after reverse. This is the backflow from the manifold of the vessel draining the lines into a tank through the mass flow meter, creating a backflow to be deducted. In this case, it's not much, but in some systems, it could go up to 2.5, 4.5 metric tons. However, the bunker ticket log still shows 80.0 metric ton delivered, where it should at least be 79.4. However, the bunker ticket log of the same totalizer is different from the actual totals you can see in the display, as the totalizer you should be checking in accordance with the ISO standard, which is 666.1. If, for example, we would say the 666.1 is the correct one, and the ticket was printed a little bit too early when not all the backflow was going through the system yet, BDN should be 77.9 metric tons instead of 80. Very difficult to check for a surveyor. And then if we make that calculation and we end on 77.9 metric tons, if we look to the right, this is the accompanying BMT, which shows 80.099 metric tons and not 77.9. But if to the far top you see an accountable alarm surveyor was not allowed to see, and to the right you see minimum quantity not reached, which means this bunker metering ticket is non-compliant. The system itself says it couldn't count the small quantity as the system is not made for it, and it was used and undersigned for the BDN quantity. And then we had a meeting because of all the issues we found in the field. Can the surveyor request be denied when asking for manual measurements, totalizers, metering profiles? Is the MFM outcome always leading for BDN figures, etc.? As a result of our questions on January 13, the Port Authorities released a letter to remind the license holder on the details that should be available for inspection during bunker deliveries. This letter describes several things, and it also describes acting in breach of the bunker license if the surveyor doesn't get the information needed to inspect the system. As you can see here, it includes certificates, tank measurements, totalizer readings, sealing checklist, the MFM system, copy of the meter profile, placement of operational seals should be permitted, and also manual measurements before and after in accordance with the ADN regulations. Hopefully, after receiving answers to our questions and every license holder read this letter and a proper check for the certification by an independent party will be done, it might be smoother sailing from now on. We had a follow-up meeting yesterday with the port authorities. Many topics are currently being discussed to improve. The story will be continued. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Martijn. Let me remind everybody to please share your questions in the chat. I could see some good questions coming in already. Don't hold back. Please just ask if you have any questions. With this, let me move on to our next speaker, Jan Christensen, Senior Director, Global Fuel Purchasing from Hapag-Lloyd. Jan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. I already have a lot of questions for Martin, so maybe I'll use my speaking time for those, but let's see. Yeah, hello everyone. So it's great seeing so many familiar faces now joining this webinar. So as Charlotte said, I'm head of fuel at Hapag-Lloyd, and I'll try to give you a short, call it bias perspective now on flow meters ADN Red 3. At Hapag we buy around 5 million tons of fuel per year. So out of that, around 1 million is in ARA. So it's obviously a very important area for us. I'll try to keep it now very, call it practical and focus on what this actually means operationally and commercially from a bias perspective. So first on mass flow meters. If you had asked me, say, 2 months ago, I would probably have been less positive about flow meters in ARA, mainly because of the poor governance, which I think also Martin mentioned around the use of flow meters. I actually do view it slightly differently now. So now when things have started moving, at least from our perspective, we can see that MFMs are actually having an effect now. So something is clearly happening. Maybe not quite as strong as we have seen it in Singapore, but we do see the price gap between, call it, high quality and low quality suppliers is narrowing. So from a buyer's perspective, maybe also from a supplier's perspective, I think that flow meters are net positive. So they add they add controls, they improve transparency, and we might also reduce some of these, call it classical or classic quantity disputes that we have all seen for probably too many years. So I do appreciate that Port of Rotterdam or the port authorities, they're not the MPA, and national and regional rules are different, but still it does worry me as a buyer that we now have to accept a system where we only measure what is being discharged. And what I just learned from Martin now is that the backflows are also not registered. So I do view it a bit like a bank account that only shows your withdrawals, but not the deposits. So I think most of the time it's fine, but when something looks wrong, then you sort of miss very important information. And given our industry's past, I also think it's fair to ask the question whether factory certification alone is actually enough here. So we know that flow meters, they can be manipulated if the governance is weak, and I think Singapore is probably the best example of where we have seen that enforcement matters just as much as the installation. So I think it's also unclear about whether there will be any active enforcement teams with clear mandates in place in Rotterdam. At least I haven't heard of it. Maybe Martin, he knows. And it's still also not clear to me, also not after Martin's presentation, whether the bunker delivery notes will actually have to be MFM based, or whether buyers and sellers can still agree otherwise. But maybe this letter from, what was it, 13th of January has sorted that out. That said, and in order not to end on a negative note on flow meters, I think installing them in the first place, it's a very important first step. It is sort of the prerequisite for, you can say, for reaching a gold standard here. So you first need the equipment on board, which I think we have to appreciate that it's being done now. So it's a good starting point now for more automation and better data quality. Now to change the slide here. Sorry. So we'll go on to ADN. And as Martin said, not everything around the use of flow meters is clear. So at least from my perspective, now is actually the time where we really need to use manual measurements as a fallback option. And exactly now, when we need it, then it's no longer available to us. So I think the timing of ADN and timing of implementing mass flow meters is somewhat unfortunate. I do have to stress up front here that ADN is, of course, mainly a safety regulation. It does improve safety, but it also limits how we as buyers can challenge quantities now, and for us at a very essential point of time. So manual measurements as a fallback option are essentially disappearing now for us as buyers for some fuels, including conventional, very and high sulfur fuel oil. What I've heard is that possibly also for distillates, but I think that depends on some interpretation. At least in the past, when something looked wrong, you could always fall back on open manual measurements, but under ADN, this is no longer compliant in many situations. So what I find unfortunate now as a buyer is the fact that we have to, or we will be forced to rely on MFM data even when things don't look right. And as I said earlier, the MFM system is really far from perfect. Again, the bank account only showing withdrawals and no deposits. I don't feel quite comfortable with that. I also see some operational risks, as if barges don't have the compliant equipment, which I hear from various counterparties that that's not the case, such as UTIs. We might also see delays and disputes that cannot be easily resolved. So in most cases, these risks sit with the buyers and not with the regulators. So that brings me on to the last topic, which is Red III. And thanks, Sophia, for running us through it. It's of course a very different topic from flow meters and ADN. So first of all, as mentioned by Sophia, the obligation sits with the suppliers, but we do need to consciously deal with the fact that costs are going to be passed on to us as buyers. There's no doubt about that. Right now, we're actually seeing already an additional premium of, I'd say, around $20 per ton in Rotterdam. And I do think as a consequence or as an effect of this, some volume is probably going to move away from Rotterdam with a $20 to $30 per ton increase. Some buyers will obviously look at other ports. At Hamburg, we've done this already. We have already moved some volume away from Rotterdam to competing ports. But clearly also some of those ports like Hamburg, Las Palmas can only absorb limited volumes now. So they cannot take everything from Rotterdam, and also they shouldn't. But logically, I would expect also prices not only to increase in Rotterdam, but also as an effect of this in the wider region. Another important point I want to make is that with this now, bunker data will also have a different role now. So BDN quantities are no longer just shall we call it a commercial matter. It's also going to have some regulatory relevance now. So any mistakes or inconsistencies, and then we're back to sort of the mass flow meters and why it's important that the readings are correct, will also have consequences now beyond the invoice. So from my perspective, I'd say this makes data quality and documentation probably more important than ever right now. So my very last slides, just summarizing what I just mentioned here. I think in general, flow meters, I think it's a step forward, and it will improve transparency, hopefully even more as we go along. ADN, it will improve safety, but it will also reduce our fallback options, which I think is somewhat unfortunate. And on Red III, it will increase cost and, as I said, also influence market pricing in the wider region. So all in all, my conclusion for this is sort of that these changes are going to shift some risks and responsibilities also towards us as buyers. So we need clear rules, we need strong enforcement, and we need good data, and then I think we're good to go. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thanks a lot, Jan. Very interesting to hear your perspective on all of this. Our next speaker is Tyler Barron, CEO of Minerva Bunkering, to share the perspective of the supplier. Tyler, over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's the slide. There we go. So yeah, I guess to start, I just say, we've been consistent and vocal advocates for more transparency and modernization to reduce or eliminate many of the market distortions that exist in our industry today. And we also are pragmatic, and we don't think that perfection should be the enemy of good. So we're supportive of, I think, the objectives that underlie these regulations, and certainly we want to kind of eliminate these market distortions with regard to fuel quantity and quality, and also support narrowing the economic gap between lower emission fuels and conventional ones. So again, the objectives I think are very positive. Nevertheless, unfortunately, from our perspective, the design and implementation of the regulations that we're discussing today, I think have various shortcomings to achieving the objectives in practice. So I guess starting with MFMs, we of course support MFMs, in terms of a very good device that's accurate at measuring quantity that do in fact pass through the line that the MFM is connected to. Certainly more accurate than manually measuring tanks. However, as we've said for a long time, and buyers know well, MFMs used outside of the proper regulatory context or the proper technology context are of limited value. The ARA regulations, we don't think represent a proper regulatory context. There's effectively no standards, as I think Martijn highlighted expertly. There's also, maybe more importantly, no monitoring, no verification, and no enforcement as part of this regulation. So I think the market, as always, is the proof. We maybe have a bit of a different perspective than what Jan expressed. From what we see, we think the evidence is that it isn't working as intended. And what we see is that, following kind of the early days where naturally there was probably some opportunistic, pricing or offering levels by suppliers at the time of the transition, once competition has set in and multiple suppliers are competing, we're seeing the same types of suppliers fixing at virtually the same types of levels as prior to the mandate. And adjusted for the ERE value, these are at premium levels that are, imply deeply negative margins without compensation for quantity shortages. So, i.e., at or modestly above ex-wharf cargo values. So, unfortunately, we don't think it's working, and that was kind of our fear going in. We don't think it's anything close to kind of a Singapore market. And so, I think that's kind of what we see as being proven out. Hopefully that changes, but that's what we're seeing at the moment. I will mention that, with this backdrop, a number of industry participants, Minerva included, have sought to, I think, achieve fulsomely the objectives that are behind this regulation in terms of complete transparency on fuel quantity and quality and operational efficiency, and have done so by forming the Bunker Services Initiative, which really does represent the global industry's new gold standard. Around 20% of the ARA market is initially participating, and of course it's open to any physical supplier or buyer that would like to comply with the requirements and participate. On the ADN side, as I think I've sort of alluded to, we don't like manual measurement. It's subject to manipulation and human error, and is, I think, a key source of some of the issues that have kind of plagued the bunkering industry. That being said, if MFMs are utilized in a weak regulatory and/or technological context, then I think eliminating the redundancy of manual measurements exacerbates the problem or the risk. And so we're all for a closed system. In fact, this is how we operate our barges within the BSI standards, where everything flowing in and out of the barge is tracked digitally and there's a auditable mass balance. But in the absence of that technology, I think trying to eliminate manual measurement as a fallback redundancy without having the ability to really fully trust MFM quantities or to validate them, we think introduces a degree of added risk, particularly for the buyers. So I think, similar to what Jan said, I think the timing of ADN with the implementation of the MFM mandate is a bit unfortunate, and we would prefer maintaining manual barge measurement as a fallback option. With regard to RED 3, so the OTC market has been starting to trade fairly actively at ERE levels that imply around $20 to $25 per metric ton of fuel. The cost of compliance from blending biocomponents directly into marine is at least biocomponents that are broadly acceptable to buyers, is quite a bit higher than where the EREs are trading OTC. So around $35 to $45 a ton. So, I think in terms of the regulation, it's effectively taxing the point of distribution rather than point of consumption. For other verticals or industrial sectors, it's generally one and the same. But as we know in marine, the point of distribution, the point of consumption are very different, which is why the Netherlands approach to RED III implementation is creating kind of such a distortion relative to other member states. We are seeing a significant shift of demand out of the Netherlands over the past few weeks. I read today that in testimony provided to the Dutch Parliament, there was a comment that 2/3 of Dutch bunker volumes will leave. We haven't seen such a significant shift, but we certainly have seen a lot of volume that is moving to other locations. Again, in terms of objective versus practical reality, certainly encouraging lower emissions fuel adoption is a universal good in our perspective. But the practical effect, if it's just shifting the demand elsewhere, and in many cases to locations that stimulate greater consumption due to deviation, then we think the regulation as it stands now is falling short of the stated objectives. Back to you, Charlotte. Happy to, of course, address any questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tyler. Also quite interesting to hear the perspective of supply side. Konstantinos, you have been listening carefully. Would you like to share the perspective of IBIA, of everything going on at the moment?
Everything going on at the moment, yes. Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Charlotte, for setting this up. And thank you all for the insightful and technically specific presentations and issues which invariably occupy our minds and our work on a daily basis. Indeed, I will only say a few words about the global perspective which we at IBIA embrace and adopt. We see, especially from what we heard today, bunkering becomes more complex by the day. And regulation fragmentation creates this jigsaw which is hard to decipher and requires help, support, and guidance. Most of all, knowledge sharing and practical intervention towards authorities, decision-making fora, and stakeholders. This is where IBIA comes in, first and foremost, with its IMO consultative status, its working groups, its diversity in its global board, which I'm honored to chair, and of course, its regional boards. We represent the interests of the whole marine energy industry, and engaging with us means being impactful, creating a vast network, acquiring in-depth knowledge on fuel developments, on regulatory issues, global and fragmented, and elsewhere through partnerships through acclaimed associations. IBIA has undergone significant changes, and in the last 2 years, these have been intensified. So to acquire even greater visibility worldwide, increase in number as well as in substance, and now reaching more than 530 members from approximately 70 countries and expanding our global network of corporations and synergies. So to engage with us is undoubtedly to be part of a community that helps shape change, a forum where operational, technical, commercial, environmental, and regulatory realities meet. European developments, which our speaker so aptly described today, they do not make things easy for anyone. We heard about RED III, the ADN situation, MFMs, the crucial perspectives of the two sides of every bunkering deal, seller and buyer. We have the fuel EU already, the delays in the IMO net zero framework, the geopolitical uncertainty, which creates almost daily waves and which reminds us that transformation is rarely linear. IBIA, with its regional boards, its working groups, its IMO consultative status, as I mentioned, will continue to play its part in helping regulatory authorities, administrations, fuel stakeholders, and ship owners to overcome the obstacles ahead. So within IBIA, you will find energy producers, bunker suppliers, ship owners, classification societies, surveyors, port authorities, lawyers like me, and regulators, each with a different perspective, yet all of us bound by the same objective: to make our industry more transparent, efficient, and hopefully sustainable. We do not shy away from debate. On the contrary, it is through constructive contact that real solutions emerge. This is shipping. A last note about our rightly famous working groups. Our Future Fuels one, which I'm proud to also chair, dealing with all new alternative and lower carbon fuels being contemplated. Our technical working group for all fuels technical and operational parameters. Our MFM bunker licensing working group, which does amazing work on the need, conditions, and enforcement of clear rules governing transparency. Our digitalization working group dealing with the technological wave that is upon us and which we must ride. More working groups will come, all voluntary, all consisting by our members wishing to actively participate. So IBIA's work is holistic and addresses issues which are important to each and every one of us, irrespective of title or position. From my side, I would like to thank you very much for your presence here today, to thank all our speakers for very, very important and practical presentations, which will, of course, be shared to everyone later on, and to thank Charlotte and the European Regional Board for setting this up. I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you very much, and Charlotte, back to you.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. I'm very happy to see that we have a very active chat with plenty of questions coming up. Please keep them coming. We are more than happy to address those right now. A question for you, Sophia. You mentioned that the RED 3 is for the suppliers. How can a ship operator ensure that they meet all the regulations? Can you simply rely on the supplier?
Thank you for the question, Charlotte. No, the short question is no. You can't simply rely on the supplier. I think what everybody here needs to do is to become more literate about these things, to be able to ask good questions back, to ask the right questions back to the supplier, so that you know what you're paying for. There's been several comments here coming up in the chat about kind of passing the cost on and how to prepare for that. And we saw some references here also from Minerva about the kind of the additional kind of impact of these fuels. I try to investigate what the penalty could be if a fuel supplier is not compliant. And in the Dutch regulation, they are talking about something called Category 6 penalty. And what is a Category 6 penalty? It's about €1,100,000 as a cap, or 10% of a company's turnover. So these are quite big costs. So yet again, and I had a comment also about this is still a draft regulation in the Netherlands. That's correct. It hasn't been implemented into law. But there's great complexity here and potential very, very big costs for everybody involved. So no, you can't trust that the fuel supplier is necessarily going to be compliant, even though he thinks he is. So I think everybody needs to do as much homework they can to be able to ask the right questions and have confidence they are getting what they pay for. I hope that was okay as an answer.
I definitely think that it highlights the complexities and some of the challenges that we see in the industry here. Another question, Jan, you had a couple of questions for Martijn. You mentioned whether there would be any enforcement in place, whether BDNs would be mass flow meter based. Do you want to elaborate on the questions, or should we just pass it over to Martijn directly?
Oh, I'd love to elaborate on. I mean, as you said, my first question would be, and I mentioned this also in one of my slides, that now it's uncertain whether BDNs will have to be MFM based, but I don't know whether Martijn has had discussions. I've read this letter from the 13th of January, but it's not really clear to me whether that's covered there. And the second question would then be in terms of call it active enforcement teams or something. How have the authorities organized themselves in terms of putting that enforcement in place, like the checks and balances? Maybe Martijn have had some discussions with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We started a sort of a small working group to look after the needs for bunker surveyors to do proper inspections and provide figures or check figures transparently. And we asked a few questions together with the survey companies in the group. For example, are BDN figures always based on the MFM outcome, or is it based on a commercial agreement? Or if there is a non-compliant MFM ticket, is there an alternative to fall back or to check manual measurements and base the BDN on this? And they say it all depends on the agreement between buyer and seller, which figures are being used, and the MFM is just an accurate way of quantity determination, nothing more, nothing less. So we don't describe where you base your BDN figures on. But this, during my presentation, I explained that in the first 1.5 week, it wasn't clear. Actually, in the first 2 weeks, it wasn't clear if that was the case. So they answered this after 2 weeks in the mandate. And then as to your other question, any enforcements in place? We have asked as well, is there a team who are basically looking after if bunker suppliers, or in this case, bunker barge operators, comply with all the requirements? And they say they have trained a team who is inspecting, but they will only inspect as soon as someone is giving them a reason to. So they're not going to do any unannounced visits. But if they get some disturbing news from the industry, for example, or questionable outcome to be investigated, they will try to visit the bunker tanker unannounced to see if all the paperwork is in order and if the system works properly.
So not really a very proactive approach, I must say.
No, as far as we know, they're only going to rely on input from surveyors and fuel buyers and suppliers, and they will investigate after there is a complaint. Yeah.
Okay. Charlotte, can I ask Tyler one question?
Of course.
So, Tyler, you mentioned that you see did you call it a significant or substantial move of volume away from Rotterdam? And I also mentioned in my part of the presentation that we have moved some volume away from Rotterdam, probably more in the region of, say, 15-20%. Nothing close to, say, 2/3, as you also mentioned. Where would you see this volume going to? And do you agree with my sort of thesis here that prices in general in the region or in the wider region will also move up as a result of it, because other areas cannot, or the ports cannot just easily and quickly absorb this volume?
Yeah, I think our spot inquiry volume is down about 25% in the last 2 weeks. So more similar to what you've seen than what I think was the comment I referred to in Parliament today. In terms of where the volume is going, our presumption is that as much of it as is possible can go to Belgium. We haven't seen a big shift in our Las Palmas spot demand, so I don't know whether it's been filtering down there, as you mentioned, as one of the alternative ports. We don't participate actively in the German market, so I don't know how much has been moving into Hamburg. But our assumption is we've seen some term volume, for instance, that leading up to Jan 1 shifted from the Netherlands to Belgium. So for vessels that have the flexibility, we think that they're probably doing that. And in terms of that price differential, we've continued to see Antwerp, I think, price at comparable to the discount for EREs. So we haven't seen kind of the Belgian market increase prices, given kind of where Rotterdam's trading.
Yeah, and in terms of the flow meters now, I think you said good, what was it? Good initiative, but poor implementation or bad design or something on the headline of your slide. Now, do you agree with me that a prerequisite for sort of reaching call it a gold standard, will have to be that you have flow meters, physical flow meters installed on all of the barges in area in Rotterdam, right? So that in itself must be a good step, right? So you can sort of say, check, right? Is there still any hope in terms of those flow meters that have now been installed? Can they reach this gold standard also in terms of like bi-directional logging and what have you, or will it need a lot of sort of like modifications from where they are right now, or the stage that they're in right now?
Yeah, so I fully support mass flow meters as a device, and that's why we use them. My only comment was, in isolation, they're of limited value, right? And I think what we've seen is, again, I looked to the market, and in markets where you have participants that have voluntarily used mass flow meters where there's no regulatory or technological context to give trust and transparency to participants, the market values that as flat to a non-mass flow meter delivery, right? And so I think there's a reason for that. I think if over time, buyers such as yourselves concluded that when somebody puts a mass flow meter on a barge in West Africa or Panama or wherever else, and you reliably see that, your consumption of your ships that are taking bunkers there is lower because you're getting all of your quantity, or you're not dealing with quantity disputes at point of delivery, then ostensibly the buy side of the market would reflect that in a premium for those supplies. That is not the case, and so I think that's why we love the device, we love the accuracy of the device, but it needs to be within the right context. So fully agree that as a first step, having them installed on board is a prerequisite to further advancement. So totally supportive of that. I think we've just been a bit disappointed that the regulatory context didn't evolve as we had pushed for it to do so, and as we had, I think, hoped, and I think as many buyers and suppliers had hoped. And I think the risk of a poorly designed regulation rather than no regulation at all is that it creates at times a false kind of imprimatur of compliance, whereas the same behavior can continue. And so the differentiation that you as a buyer have to kind of engage in between the full value proposition of one supplier versus another, in some ways that calculus or that guesswork has been made more complicated, not less, by a regulation that doesn't have a strong regulatory framework to it.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler.
Yeah,
guesswork, that's probably describes it. Sorry, Charlotte?
No, I just noticed that Claudia raised her hand. Claudia, do you want to add something? You're also quite involved in the area.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on that point that you mentioned, Jan, with the bidirectional measurement. That issue has been identified. Basically, technically, flow meters by default measure in two directions. There have been some installations identified in Rotterdam or ARA where the installation was done in the correct way, but something in the software does not deduct this backflow from delivery flow. That has been identified, as Martijn already said, also mentioned by a number of stakeholders to the authorities, even confronted that specific supplier with this issue. So I can only call to action. When people see this, keep reporting it, because it is not best practice and it's not how it should be. Technically, those installations are good, but there is something in the software which is not done as it should be done. So it has to be reported, and then hopefully enforcement will come into play, because that's the only way to fix the issues.
Thanks a lot for those extra comments, Claudia. Definitely a quite interesting situation that we have there. Konstantinos, I think a final question for you. We hear a lot about all these challenges that we see in ARA with the mass flow meters and the sampling and all of that. Could IBIA have ensured that this would not have happened? Could IBIA have done anything in this aspect?
You mean what could have we done and we didn't?
No, more yeah, yes and no, because also how can we improve similar situations going forward from other areas that will start a similar change in the industry?
IBIA could not have done anything more for the simple reason that IBIA is not part of the regulators framework. We're not regulating. Had we been part of the regulating scheme, we would have done things differently, but we're not. We are an NGO which is based on the diversity of its membership and trying to push regulators and trying to push decision-making fora to proceed to decisions which are technically sound, which are balanced, which are meticulous, and which do not leave the issue of transparency or technical reasonability untouched. Some of these fragmented measures do leave huge gaps, and we see the problems from our discussion here today. What IBIA is doing is focusing on specific areas, and ARA is one such specific areas where we provide this holistic reasoning for changing situations which will lead to problematic situations, or to enhance an already established regime to make it much more comprehensive and much more balanced for both sides. Now, I'll give you a simple example. We do find, I'm talking now not only as IBIA chair, but as a buyer. I'm the bunker director of Starbucks, which is a big bunker buyer. The situation with the ADN is problematic. It's a problem for us. It creates real problems for us as buyers. Now, IBIA, embracing all stakeholders from any type of position or vantage point, tries to persuade the authorities that this creates problems. These problems are not one side's problems. It's the system's problems. It's irrespective whether you're a buyer or a seller. If a regulator is trying to enforce something, then it must have means to actually enforce it. Not only announcing measures, but being able all along the chain of steps needed, legislative, applicability, enforcement, to be really sound, logical, first of all, and enforceable. And this is where IBIA comes in through its board, both global, regionals, its working groups, and through the fact that we have experts within our membership. Now, IBIA and other associations like IBIA can only push, can only pressurize regulators. But if you have a strong voice, like IBIA does, I believe that regulators will listen to reason. We very often have regulators, representatives in our deliberations, in our members' meetings, in our one-on-one meetings, and thankfully we are able to pass across our message. So to finish up, what IBIA could have done more? Nothing. We did the best we can given our position. We are not a decision-making organization. We are an organization which points out to regulators exactly the how, the why, and the when things should be implemented in our sector.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. I think on that note, I will end this very interesting webinar, at least from my perspective. Let me thank all the participants for joining, and hopefully you have gained some additional insight to this topic. And thanks a lot to all the speakers for your insights, sharing those as well as your perspective. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.